be on Pastor Bohr right now and on all the rest of us as we listen. We thank you for hearing us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Brother David. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to bring this closer. If you don't come to me, I will come to you. That way I won't get the glare from the lights.
Yeah.
Well, let me preface a little bit before we take a look at this material that you received. Probably it was 12 years ago that I was going to present this particular topic at 3ABN at one of their camp meetings. And word got around that I was going to share these ideas. And the ideas were so out of the box, so different in their understanding, that 3ABN last minute, probably about an hour before, asked me to change the topic or to change the particular lecture. I still spoke on the Sabbath, but I did not share this particular one because it has some ideas which are very Adventist, but also thinking a little bit out of the box, very biblical. And so this afternoon, I would like to share this with you, and you will tell me when we finish whether it makes sense and whether you feel it's biblical or not. I have presented this many years ago here at Fresno Central Church, maybe on a Sabbath morning. I don't remember whether it was a Sabbath morning or a prayer meeting. But we have many new people, and probably most of the old people have forgotten it anyway. So it's a good thing for the old people to review, and a good thing for the new people maybe to hear it for the first time. I've given you a full copy of what we're going to present. We're going to do what I regularly do in prayer meeting, and that is we're going to go through this material, and it's going to take us a while. There's 12 pages. Of course, it's size 14 type, so that means that it's probably, if it was 12 type, which is what I usually use, it would probably be more like 9 or 10 pages. But bear with me. I feel that this is very important. And at the end, if we have time, I'm going to give a period for questions and comments, because I'd like to get your feedback. So let's go to the material. It is written. As I examined the story in Genesis about creation, I always wondered about two things. Number one, why God did not give a direct command to Adam and Eve to keep the Sabbath. If the Sabbath is so important and the Sabbath is a creation institution, then why didn't God just simplify things for us and say to Adam and Eve, you shall keep this seventh-day Sabbath? That was the first question. Why no direct command to keep the Sabbath, that first Sabbath, Adam and Eve, if the Sabbath is a creation institution? Incidentally, this is an important question because many non-Adventist scholars, as well as some who have left the church, have used this as an argument that the Sabbath is not a creation institution. They say there's nowhere in the book of Genesis where it says that Adam and Eve were commanded to keep the Sabbath. Therefore, the Sabbath appears for the first time in Exodus 16. It is a Jewish institution. So we have to have an answer for that. And so I believe that this material provides a very solid biblical answer why God did not command Adam and Eve to keep that first Sabbath. The second question that I always had as I examined the testimony of creation in Genesis is that every day had an evening and a morning except the seventh day. It never says it was the evening and the morning of the seventh day. For each day it said it was the evening and the morning. First day, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. But when it comes to the seventh day, it doesn't say it was the evening and the morning of the seventh day. And so my question was, why doesn't it say it was the evening and the morning of the seventh day? I had a teacher once who said, well, maybe Moses forgot to write it. I looked at him and I said, no, I don't buy that answer that you give me. Because I believe that if it was important, it would have been included in the Genesis record. So those are the two questions that we're going to struggle with in our study this afternoon. Why no direct command in Genesis for Adam and Eve to keep that first Sabbath? Creation. God is at the center of the creation story. Over 30 times, just in Genesis chapter 1, we find expressions such as God created, God said, God saw, God called, God made, God set them, that is the heavenly bodies, God blessed. Over 30 times, just in chapter 1. So I think God is trying to tell us that the first 6 days of creation are all about God. Because God is the one that is doing everything. In fact, let's read Genesis 1:31, and we'll see that the first 6 days of creation are all about God and none about man. It says there in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, then God saw everything that He had made. Who made? God made. Then God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good, so the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So very clearly, everything that was created the first 6 days was made by whom? Was made by God, and therefore we find that everything that God made belongs to Him. Would you agree? Yes. To whom does the light belong? To God. To whom does the firmament belong? God. To whom do the trees and the flowers and the plants belong? To God. To whom do the sun, moon, and stars belong? God. To whom do the fish belong? God. To whom do the birds belong? God. To whom do the animals belong? God. To whom does man belong? God. In the generic sense. But the Sabbath belongs to the Jews. Are you seeing how absurd that is? Everything God made the first 6 days belongs to God because God made it. So if God made the Sabbath must belong to Him as well. Amen. So the first 6 days of creation are all about God. God did all of the creating. God did all of the work of creation. But the same is true of the seventh day. The seventh day is all about God. Notice what we find in Genesis chapter 2 and verses 2 and 3. By the way, 8 times it's repeated in these 2 verses that God did all the work of creation, and twice it is mentioned that God rested on the seventh day. No reference to man resting. Twice it says God rested. And 8 times it says that God was the one who worked. Let's read Genesis chapter 2 and verses 2 and 3. It says, and on the seventh day, God ended His work which He had done. Now let's stop there just for a moment. Did you notice that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, it says, then God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good, so the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And then you read chapter 2 and verse 1, and it says that everything was what? Everything was finished. So which day was everything finished? The sixth day. But now wait a minute. Here it says, on the seventh day God ended His work. Are you seeing the problem here? It says the sixth day He finished, and then it says the seventh day He ended. By the way, it's the same Hebrew word, finished and ended. So it could be translated, He finished the sixth day and He finished the seventh. So how can you finish something twice? I believe that the best answer to this is by comparing the work of God with the work of an artist. An artist who is, making on the canvas a beautiful masterpiece. You know what he does first? He prepares the frame, puts the canvas over it. the staples on the sides. And then he adds some base colors, and after the first day he looks and he says, it's good. Second day, this is a nature portrayal. The second day he adds a few objects, there, maybe some clouds in the sky. Then the second day he looks and he says, it's good. Third day, he draws some flowers and some plants and some trees filled with fruit. And when he finishes the third day, he says, it's good. Then the fourth day, he puts the sun in the sky. And you can just vaguely see the moon there, Finishes his work the fourth day, he says, good. Then the fifth day, he makes some flying birds and some fish jumping out of the waters. And he finishes his work the fifth day. He looks and he says, good. Then the sixth day, he makes, he portrays animals on the land. And he creates two individuals there in the midst of this beautiful scene. And he gives the final touches to the canvas. And he looks and he says, it is very good. Is he finished? I said he finished. What is missing? The signature that identifies who made it. God finished his work the sixth day, but he put his signature on his work the seventh day. That's how God ended twice. He actually finished the work of painting the portrait in 6 days. The seventh day, it was incomplete until he what? Until he signed the work that he performed. Now let's notice what we find in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Somehow I think God wants us to know that he's the one who did it. Do you notice the number of times that this is underlined? So it says at least 8 times that God did all the work, and it says twice that it was God who rested. Now we need to understand that word rested. The word rested, as probably we know, is the Hebrew word Shabbat. Now the word Shabbat does not describe the manner of rest or the quality of rest, the way in which God rested on the seventh day. The word Shabbat simply means to cease doing something, to do something no more. In other words, the seventh day, God ceased his work of creating. He created no more. So in other words, the word Shabbat helps us understand what God did not do the seventh day, but it doesn't teach us what God did. He ceased his work of creating. By the way, we use the same type of expression today. You know, when the district attorney finishes presenting his case before court, what does he say? The prosecution rests. And of course that means that the prosecution is going on vacation to Hawaii. No, what does it mean? It means that he has no more to present. The prosecution has ceased presenting their case. It doesn't say what they did after they ceased presenting their case. It simply says that they presented no more. So on the seventh day, God ceased his work of creation. That's what the word Shabbat means. God ceased from creating. He created no more. He finished his work of creation on the sixth day. Now, this word, Shabbat, is used in that way in the Old Testament. It probably should be translated there in Genesis, on the seventh day God ceased, rather than rested. Although rested catches the idea, you know, that he didn't do any more, by extension. I want to give you 2 examples from the Old Testament, and there are others, where the word Shabbat is used, and it means cease. Notice Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 3. We're on page 2 here. Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 3. Nehemiah is rebuilding the wall. The enemies are trying to entice him to come down to them because they don't want him to build the wall. And notice what Nehemiah had to say. Nehemiah 6 verse 3. So I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work what? That is the identical word Shabbat in Genesis 2, 2, and 3. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? So what does the word Shabbat there mean? To not build. To stop building. In Genesis it means God stopped what? Creating. He ceased his work of creation. Notice another example from Psalm 46, 8 and 9. Psalm 46, verses 8 and 9. Here it's talking about the time when wars come to an end. Are we looking forward to that? Amen. Praise the Lord. It says there, come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes wars what? Cease. It's the word Shabbat. Identical word of Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. He makes wars. What does that mean? No more wars. What does Shabbat mean in Genesis? No more work. Ceased. And then it says he makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. So the word Shabbat does not describe the manner of God's rest, how God rested, the quality of his rest on the seventh day. All it tells us is that on the seventh day, God ceased his work of creating. It doesn't tell us what he did on the seventh day. Well, he was ceasing. Are you with me? Amen. Now, let me read you a statement from Kenneth Vine. I don't quote scholars very frequently, unless it's Ellen White, who I consider to be the scholar of scholars.
Amen.
Kenneth Vine, who was an expert at defining biblical words, explains what Sabbath means. The writer of Genesis, this is the top of page 3, the writer of Genesis 2 verse 3 is not stressing rest from work, but rather God's what? Ceasing from his creative work since it was complete. And he's an expert at defining Hebrew and Greek words. Now, the first week of the history of this world is what I call God's week. It's not man's week. The first week is not man's week. The first week is God's week. Because God is the one who what? Who worked 6, and God is the one who what? Who rested on the 7th. No reference to man working in the work of creation or of man resting. Because the emphasis is not on man, the emphasis is on whom? The emphasis is on God. God worked 6, God rested on the 7th. No reference to man working, no reference, and that is the work of creation. I'm not talking about keeping the garden. God told Adam to keep the garden, but he's not creating anything. I'm talking about the creative work during creation week. And then God on the 7th day ceased. But then, of course, we're left with the question. How did God rest on the 7th day? What was the quality of his rest like? What did God do on the 7th day while he was ceasing? In what manner did God rest on the 7th day? The fact is that the word Shabbat doesn't help us. But there are other Hebrew words that do help us understand what God did on the 7th day. Not only what he didn't do, he didn't create anymore, he ceased, but what he actually did. Now I can assure you one thing, and that is that God, the quality of God's rest on the 7th day was not that he was famished. He was not tired. After all, how much tiredness does it cause to say, let there be light? Let there be the firmament. God spoke things into existence. You know, he wasn't exhausted. Notice Isaiah 40, verse 28. We know that the quality of his rest, the seventh day, was not because he was tired. It says in Isaiah 40, verse 28, and by the way, this is not taken out of context, it's dealing with creation. And we're talking about creation. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. God does not get weary. God does not get tired. So whatever God's rest was on the seventh day, it was not a rest, a physical rest, so to speak. So the question is, what was God's rest like? Shabbat won't help us, because it simply says he ceased. But what did he do while he ceased on the seventh day? We have a couple of other Hebrew words that are going to help us understand the quality of God's rest, the manner or the how of God's rest on the seventh day. Exodus 31, verse 17 has one of those words. It's the Hebrew word nafash. There's a similar word, which is the word nephesh, which is translated living soul. Living soul. In Genesis 2, verse 7, the word nephesh. Nephesh shaya. Exodus 31, verse 17 says, it, that is the Sabbath, is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And now it gives the reason why it's a sign. By the way, it's not a sign exclusively for Israel. Well, doesn't it say here it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever? Yeah. Does it say it was exclusively for Israel? Did God give all of the 10 Commandments to Israel? Did he? Did he give all the 10 Commandments to Israel? So you shall have no other gods before me, that's for the Jews.
No.
Don't make images, that's for the Jews. Respect the name of God, that's for the Jews. Well, he gave all the 10 Commandments to the Jews, right? Honor your father and mother for the Jews. Don't kill for the Jews. Don't commit adultery for the Jews. Don't steal for the Jews. Don't bear false witness for the Jews. Don't covet for the Jews. God gave all of the 10 Commandments to the Jews. Does that mean that the 10 Commandments are exclusively for the Jews? So why would the Sabbath be exclusively for the Jews? God made it a sign between him and Israel because Israel was God's people at that particular time. But it doesn't mean that after that, at the end, write down your questions so we don't lose our train of thought. We'll give a few minutes at the end for questions. So it says, the Sabbath is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6, here comes the reason, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested. What word is that? He rested? The same word in Genesis. He ceased and was what? Refreshed. There we have a new word. Refreshed. What does the word refresh mean? The experts in the Hebrew language have said that the word nafash, the word refreshed, as it's translated here, means to take a breath. It's easier to demonstrate what nafash is rather than defining it. I'm going to show you what nafash is. This is nafash. What comes to mind when you see me do that? I heard the word here. Satisfaction. It's a sigh. I'm finished. It cannot mean that God, needs refreshment because he's tired, because we already read that God doesn't get tired. So it must be a different kind of refreshment. What did God do on the seventh day? On the seventh day, God took a breath. In other words, he contemplated the work of his hands, and he went. I'm going to read you a statement from Ellen White, where she amplifies this, and you're going to see how close Ellen White is to the definition of this word. So the first thing that we see that God did on the seventh day was that God was refreshed. God took a breath. But there's another Hebrew word which helps us understand as well what the quality of God's rest was on the seventh day. Now, before we take a look at this, I want to ask you, who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. Who wrote the book of Exodus? Moses. Same writer wrote Genesis and wrote Exodus. Now, what three things does Genesis tell us that God did on the seventh day? He rested. What else? He blessed the seventh day. And what else did he do? He sanctified it or made it holy. Three things in Genesis. We read it. Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. God rested, God blessed, and God sanctified. That's what Moses wrote in Genesis chapter 2. Are those the same three things that are mentioned in the fourth commandment? Let's go to Exodus 20, verse 11. Exodus 20 and verse 11. Well, let's see if the same three things are found in the fourth commandment. It says there in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, this is the conclusion to the fourth commandment. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, or made it holy. Same three things in the fourth commandment? Yes. But there's a difference. You say, now, what is the difference? In Genesis, when Moses writes that God rested, he uses Shabbat. But in Exodus, he uses a different Hebrew word. He uses the Hebrew word nuach. And so immediately you ask the question, if Moses wrote Genesis and he wrote Exodus, why does he use Shabbat in Genesis and he uses nuach in Exodus? And the reason is simple. In Genesis, the emphasis is that God ceased on the seventh day, whereas in the book of Exodus, because God is giving us an example of rest, it is defining the quality of God's rest on the seventh day. So we need to understand what the word nuach means. Notice 1 Chronicles 22 and verse 9. This is on page 5. 1 Chronicles 22 verse 9. Speaking about Solomon, whom God would raise up to govern Israel. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of nuach, a man of rest. It wouldn't do much sense to say he will be a man of ceasing. What was he going to give Israel? He was going to give Israel rest. And I will give him, there it is again, nuach, rest, from all his enemies all around. Are you understanding that we're talking about quality of rest now? Yes. His name shall be Solomon, for I will give what? Now here comes some ideas that are linked with it. I will give what? I will give peace and quietness to Israel in his days. Do we have a definition of the quality of rest here in nuach? What is it linked with? It is linked with rest, with peace, and with what? With quietness. But you know in the Bible it's also, the word nuach is also linked with joy and feasting and gladness. Notice two texts. Remember the book of Esther? The book of Esther, you know, is a spectacular book. It really is a foreshadowing of the end of time. And in the book of Esther, after Israel was delivered, their enemies did not attack them because the king had given a decree that the Jews could defend themselves. And so, to commemorate their deliverance, a feast was established. It's called the Feast of Purim. It's like a carnaval in Brazil. You know, the Orthodox Jews wear masks, and they have, you know, lots of food, and they have dancing. It's just a day of rejoicing, because they're commemorating their deliverance from certain death, from genocide in the days of Esther. Now notice how the word Nuach is used in conjunction with this Feast of Purim. Esther 9, 17 and 18. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day of the month, they, what? Rested. That's Nuach. Now what is rested linked with? They rested and made it a day of gloom and sadness. No, of feasting and gladness. By the way, do you know that it's forbidden of the Jews to fast on Sabbath? Because the Sabbath is a day of feasting, not a day of fasting. I did not say a day of gluttony.
No.
It is a day, Ellen White says that there's supposed to be a special meal on Sabbath. A vegan meal. I knew that that would make Jeannie happy. So what kind of rest was this? Just sitting down and going to sleep? No. It's an active rest, isn't it? It's a day of feasting and gladness. Verse 18. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th. And on the 15th of the month they rested. There's the word nuach again. And made it a day of feasting and gladness. Do you start to catch a picture of what God is doing on the seventh day? The word nafash said God is going, it is very good. And nuach says that it becomes a day of what? A day of feasting and gladness and joy and happiness as the universe contemplates the glorious works of God. Let's read one other text where this word Noach is used. And by the way, it's used many times in the Old Testament, not always with connection to the Sabbath. Proverbs 29:17 is talking about disciplining our children, which is a rare practice today indeed.
Yep.
Notice what it says. Correct your son, and he will give you Noach. What does that mean? Correct your son, he'll give you Noach. He'll give you rest. Well, the second half of the verse explains what kind of rest. It says, correct your son and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give what? Delight to your soul. So what kind of rest are we talking about here? Delightful. Do you understand now why the same word is used in Isaiah 58 where it says if you call the Sabbath a delight? Are you starting to catch a picture of how God's rest was on the seventh day? See, Shabbat means he ceased. Okay, Lord, you ceased, you quit. Now, what did you do on the seventh day? Oh, I went. And it was a day of rejoicing, feasting, and gladness. Listen to what Ellen White had to say about this. Patriarchs and Prophets, stop on page 6. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 47. The little lady is always in harmony with Scripture, folks. The PhDs might say, well, she didn't have a PhD. Yeah, but she was inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
That's good enough for me.
Amen.
God looked with what?
Satisfied.
What is the equivalent Hebrew word for that? He took a breath. By the way, does the Bible say that God looked upon the work that he had made? Is that what Genesis 1:31 says? God saw everything that he had made.
Well, that's looking.
So after he created, did God, the first 6 days, did God contemplate his work? Genesis 1:31 says so. He saw everything that he made. And it was not only good, it was very good. And so God takes a sigh and says, oh, it's good. Very good. By the way, do you know that God didn't celebrate by himself? The whole heavenly universe celebrated with him. You say, where's that in the Bible? Let's go to Job 38, verses 4 through 7. Job 38, 4 through 7. God is referring to creation. And of course, he's asking Job a series of questions. Because Job has asked God a whole bunch of questions. So God says to Job, now you be quiet, I'm going to ask you some questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, God is speaking with a note of sarcasm here. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? What event is being described here? Creation. Now what happened at creation? Verse 7. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Was God the only one who had feasting and gladness and joy and happiness? Who are the morning stars? Were the angels singing at creation too? Celebrating? Feasting? Gladness? Joy? Amazing. Now notice how Ellen White comments on this. Desire Ages 281. The Sabbath was hallowed at creation. As ordained for man, it had its origin when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And now notice the idea of peace. Remember we read Noah, Solomon? Peace brooded over the world. For earth was in harmony with heaven. Perfect peace in the universe on the seventh day. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And now notice, he rested in the what? In the joy of his completed work. Ellen White didn't know Hebrew, as far as I know. But she catches the meaning of the Hebrew words. Notice Desire of Ages, page 769. In the beginning, the Father and the Son had rested upon the Sabbath after their work of creation. When the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them, the Creator and all heavenly beings rejoiced in what? In contemplation of the glorious scene. What was the seventh day about? It was a day of contemplation, a day of peace, a day of joy, a day of gladness, a day of feasting. Can we understand a little better what the seventh day was for God? What God did, what the heavenly universe did? But now we come to a very important point. When was the Sabbath sanctified and blessed? Now, for many years in my ministry, until probably about 12 years ago, I had assumed that God had blessed and sanctified the Sabbath as that seventh day began. And that God had told Adam and Eve, this day that is about to begin is holy, I bless it, keep it. But as I examined this more closely, I discovered that God did not bless and sanctify the Sabbath until it ended. And that's what was so controversial at 3 ABN. Because they hadn't heard this before. So you mean to say that God did bless and sanctify the Sabbath until the Sabbath ended? That's what the Bible and Ellen White teach. And you say, who cares? It's vitally important. Because it'll help us understand why God did not command Adam and Eve to rest on that first Sabbath. It provides a perfect argument for those who say that the Sabbath is not a creation institution because God did not command Adam and Eve to keep that first Sabbath. Your answer is clear from Scripture and from the Spirit of prophecy. Let's go to Genesis 2, verse 3, the bottom of page 6, and read this carefully. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Why did he bless and sanctify it? Because in it he what? He rested from all his work which God had created and made. So what did God do? Did he rest and then bless and sanctify? Or did he rest, bless, and sanctify all at the same time? He rested and then he sanctified it and blessed it. Because it says, he blessed the seventh day and sanctified it because in it he rested. So he rested and then he blessed and sanctified. The fourth commandment is even clearer. Notice Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. And by the way, there's a Hebrew mechanism that is used here, which is called the athnak, which kind of, it plays the function of a period. And that's why, you read Exodus 20, verse 11, you say, that period there just doesn't seem to fit. But really, the period goes there because it breaks the flow. It says, therefore, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested, that's Noah, rested the seventh day. Period. And then what's the next word? Therefore. Because he rested on the seventh day, therefore, what? The Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Why did God bless the Sabbath day and hallow it? Because he had rested on the day. So God rested, and then, when the day ended, he blessed and sanctified it. In other words, every second that God rested became a holy second. Every minute that God rested became a holy minute. Every hour that God rested became a holy hour. And when God had rested all 24 hours, the whole day was holy.
Amen.
So what makes the Sabbath holy is God's rest. Are you with me? God did not command the seventh day to be holy. God's rest made the seventh day holy. By the way, that's the reason why Sunday can never be holy, because God did not rest on it. Because it's God's rest that makes the day holy. Let's see if Ellen might know about this. Yeah, I don't know how I missed all these statements throughout most of my ministry. 28 years of my ministry. It's so clear in the writings of God. It's clear in the Bible. Do you find it clear in the Bible?
Amen.
Now, Ellen White, I've read her statements, never makes a mistake. She always explains that God rested, and then he said, this day is holy, and he blessed it. Notice the middle of page 7. After resting upon the seventh day. Now, what part of after don't you understand? After resting upon the seventh day, God sanctified it, or set it apart as a day of rest for man. When did the Sabbath become a day of rest for man? When the Sabbath ended. Are you with me or not?
Yes.
You say, Pastor, this is too revolutionary. It is. Because we're not used to thinking this way. See? And when there's new light, or a new understanding of old light, immediately our tendency is to say, no, that can't be. Impossible. We have to have an open mind. When we study the Bible, when we read the Spirit of prophecy. That's Patriarchs and Prophets, page 47. Notice, Desire of Ages 281. Because he had rested upon the Sabbath. What? Because he had rested upon the Sabbath, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. So when did he bless and sanctify it? After he rested. And now notice this. Because he had rested upon the Sabbath, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, set it apart to a holy use. He gave it to Adam. When did God give the Sabbath to Adam? That first Sabbath was not Adam's Sabbath, it was God's Sabbath. Are you following me? Theologically very important. Extremely important theological insight. Because it totally demolishes the idea that the Sabbath is not a creation institution, because God did not tell Adam and Eve to keep that first Sabbath. That first Sabbath, God did not tell Adam and Eve to keep that first Sabbath, because the first Sabbath is about God. It's not about man. So it says, because he had rested upon the Sabbath, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, set it apart to a holy use. He gave it to Adam as a day of rest. It was a memorial of the work of creation, and thus a sign of God's power and his love. Here's another one. My Life Today 259. It's a devotional book. The Lord's Day, mentioned by John, was the Sabbath. The Lord's Day in Revelation 1 verse 10 was the Sabbath, the day on which Jehovah rested after the great work of creation, and which he blessed and sanctified because he had rested upon it. He blessed it and sanctified it. Why? Because he had rested upon it. There it is again. Here's another one. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 247. God blessed and sanctified the seventh day because he rested upon it from all his wondrous work of creation. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 111. The first 6 days of each week are given to man for labor because God employed the same period of the first week in the work of the creation. On the seventh day, man is to refrain from labor in commemoration of the Creator's rest. We'll come back to that in a few moments. Two more. Great Controversy 453. Hallowed by the Creator's rest. What does hallowed mean? So what is it that made the Sabbath holy? So every second that God rested became what? Holy. Every minute that God rested became what? Every hour that God rested became what?
Holy hour.
So when God rested every single second of the Sabbath, the whole day was what?
Holy.
Holy. Hallowed by the Creator's rest and blessing, the Sabbath was kept by Adam in his innocence in holy Eden. And this is my own addition when I put it in brackets. Notice that Adam kept the Sabbath after it had been hallowed and blessed. And this happened when the seventh day had ended. Are you getting that point? Now, if you didn't understand any of the other quotations, I'll read one last one. Review and Herald, September 16, 1862. Instead of keeping God's own rest day, she's talking about Sunday keepers, which he sanctified after he had rested upon it. Excuse me? Is that clear enough?
Clear.
Instead of keeping God's own rest day, which he sanctified after he had rested upon it, and set it up apart for man. When did God set the Sabbath apart for man? When the day began or when it ended? When it ended.
Yes.
Set it apart for man to observe and reverence. They honor a what? A papal institution. The second Sabbath is the one that God gave to man. You say, now wait a minute. Let's pursue this. Who was it that rested on the first Sabbath? God rested. Could God give the Sabbath to man before he made it? No.
That's the key.
He had to make it, and then he could give it to man. So was that first Sabbath man's Sabbath when the day began? No, because it wasn't made yet. And you say, well, was the Sabbath made? Yeah, the Sabbath was made for man. It's part of God's work of creation. Secondly, how could God tell Adam and Eve to keep that first Sabbath holy if it wasn't holy until it ended?
That's right.
You're not with me.
I'm with you.
Further, how could Adam and Eve follow God's example of keeping the Sabbath unless God first gave them the example? That's what Ellen White had to say. Lift him up, page 38. God made man in his own image and then gave him what?
An example.
An example of observing the seventh day, which he sanctified and made holy. So what did God do? He gave man an example of keeping the Sabbath. Notice the following quotation, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 47. After resting upon the seventh day, God sanctified it or set it apart as a day of rest for man. Following the example of the Creator, man was to rest upon this sacred day, that as he should look upon the heavens and the earth, he might reflect upon God's great work of creation, and that as he should behold the evidences of God's wisdom and goodness, his heart might be filled with love and reverence for his Maker. Now the best argument is still the last one on here. What does the fourth commandment say?
Remember.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, yes, but then it says,
6 days.
6 days you shall labor, and then it says, and you should what?
Do all your work.
Do all your work, and then what day are we supposed to rest?
For the 7
For the
days of
seventh
Sabbath
day.
God says, work 6
days.
and rest the 7th. The fourth commandment could not be kept by Adam and Eve on that first Sabbath because they had not worked 6.
My God.
Amen.
God.
Are you with me or not?
Amen.
Who worked 6?
God.
Who rested on the 7th?
God.
Do you know what God created? God created the week.
Yes. Yes.
And when He created the week, He gave it to man.
Amen.
He said, okay, but whose week is it? It's God's week. Whose Sabbath is it? It's God's Sabbath. He lends it to us, but it's His. Like everything else He made is His. The Sabbath is His because He made it. It does not belong to the Jews. What an insult to say that the Sabbath is the Sabbath of the Jews. What an insult to
Amen.
God.
Amen.
Are you understanding this argument? So which is the Sabbath that God commands Adam and Eve to keep? In the light of the fourth commandment, it says, God is saying, look, I worked 6, I rested the 7th, now you are to what? You're to follow my example by working 6 and resting on the 7th. Are we clear so far? Notice Mark 2 verse 27. Mark 2 verse 27. This is Jesus speaking, and He said to them, the Sabbath was what? Was made for man. The Greek word anthropos. It's not made for the Jews. It's made for man, generically speaking. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And notice these quotations from Ellen White. Priceless. You know, Ellen White is so far outnumbered by scientists and scholars today, even some in the Adventist church, who say, well, you know, the story of creation is a symbolic story. You know, the days of creation were not literal. Yeah, we believe that God actually created, but God used evolution as His method of creation, you know, and He used a progressive creation method. And you have Adventist theologians that are fiddling with the Scriptures. The fact is, the Bible is clear. And if you don't, you know, if you don't think the Bible is clear enough, then Ellen White is. And if you beg to differ with Ellen White, then you're questioning inspiration. Like the Sabbath, the week originated at creation. And it has been preserved and brought down to us through Bible history. Has God preserved the 7-week cycle? 7-day cycle? From the beginning. So much for the idea of the people who say we're supposed to keep the lunar Sabbath. That's probably, you haven't heard about the lunar Sabbath. That means that keeping the Sabbath is determined by the moon. They call it the lunisolar Sabbath. And it's a loony idea. Yeah, they say the Sabbath falls on the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and 29th of the month. It doesn't matter which day it falls on. That's the Sabbath. Now imagine God giving a Sabbath where you have to keep a Sabbath on a different day of the week each week. Imagine the work nightmare. Oh, I can't work, boss, tomorrow. Tomorrow's my Sabbath. So the next week they say, well, you know, last week it was Wednesday. Today it's Thursday. God does not work that way. She continues writing, God Himself measured off the first week as a sample for successive weeks to the close of time. Like every other, it consisted of 7 literal days. 6 days were employed in the work of creation. Upon the 7th, God rested and then blessed this day and set it apart as a day of rest for man. We already read this one. Because He had rested upon the Sabbath, God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, set it apart to a holy use. He gave it to Adam as a day of rest. Now the question is, how does man relate to that first Sabbath? Which day was man created? Man, generically speaking, including male and female. Genesis uses it in that sense sometimes.
6 days.
What day was man created?
6 days.
The 6th day. So were Adam and Eve present when God kept the Sabbath?
Yes.
Were they observing God?
Yes.
Were they looking at how God in the universe was keeping the Sabbath?
Yes.
Of course. They were looking at God's example and saying, oh, so this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to celebrate. It's supposed to be a day of feasting and gladness, to bring a little extra fruit on the table. They were created the 6th day. and they were to follow God's example. Now let's look at the bottom of page 9. Then we're going to come, we haven't dealt yet with why no evening and morning on the seventh day. Once we've understood this first part, the second part is actually quite easy. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 48, God saw that a Sabbath was essential for man even in paradise. Let me ask you this, if it was essential in paradise, is it more essential today?
Yes.
Is it more likely that we would forget God today than in paradise? Obviously. He needed to lay aside his own interests and pursuits for one day of the 7. For what reason? That he might more fully contemplate the works of God and meditate upon his power and goodness. He needed a Sabbath to remind him more vividly of God and to awaken gratitude because all that he enjoyed and possessed came from the beneficent hand of the Creator. Is that the way we keep the Sabbath? Food for thought. Now let's ask the question, why no evening and morning of the 7th day? Why is there no evening and morning of the 7th day? Here's the key. Remember that the first week is whose week?
God.
It's God's week. He worked 6, and he ceased on the 7th. The 7th day had no evening and morning. Now, don't miss this. Had no evening and morning for God because he did not begin a new cycle of work the next day. Are you following me or not? Did God begin a new cycle the next day? Did he say, okay, I'm going to work 6, I'm going to rest the 7? No. God ceased his work of creating. That is, God is still ceasing from his creative works. Put another way, when God ceased on the 7th day, he continued ceasing because he did not work to create on the next day. On the other hand, now you say, what about us? What about us? The first week isn't about us. It's about God. So don't mix us in there. So you say, well, does that mean that the 7th day doesn't have an evening and morning for us? No, it does have an evening and morning for us because God told Adam and Eve, work 6 and rest the 7th. So don't mix God in here. Or don't mix us with God. The first week, we're talking about the 7th day, God ceasing, in other words. Put another way, when God ceased on the 7th day, he continued ceasing because he did not work to create on the next day. On the other hand, the next day was a day of work for man. So the 7th day did have an evening and morning for man. Where do we find this in the Bible? Notice Genesis 1:31 through Genesis 2 verse 1. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth and all of the host of them were finished. So did God begin a new cycle of work after that Sabbath? Or is God still ceasing from his work of creation? He's still ceasing. Does that apply to us? No, because we're not still ceasing. God said, now you're going to do this every week. Notice Hebrews 4 verse 3. This is written over 4,000 years after creation. And God was still ceasing. Because it says there, and yet his work, that is God's work, has been what? Finished since the creation of the world. So is God still resting from his work of creation?
Yes.
Yes. He's still ceasing. What does Ellen White have to say about this? The little lady understood this too. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 115. As regards this world, God's work of creation is what? Completed. And now she quotes Hebrews 4. For the works were finished from the foundation of the world. But his energy is still exerted in what? In upholding the objects of his creation. So God has not begun a new cycle of creation, but he upholds that which he created. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, I work until now, and my Father works. He had just healed the legs of a paralytic. He had restored, in other words. He wasn't creating him again. He was restoring what was created at the beginning. Bible Commentary, Volume 6, page 1062. Although the Lord has ceased his work in creating, he is constantly employed in upholding and using as his servants the things which he has made. Said Christ, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Education 130 and 131. As regards this earth, Scripture declares that the work of creation to have been what? Completed. The works were finished from the foundation of the world. But the power of God is still exercised in upholding the objects of his creation. Now, does the fact that the Sabbath had no evening and morning for God mean that it has no evening and morning for us? No, because starting on the first day of the week, after that Sabbath, God ceases the cycle of work and rest. But he says to man, now you're on a continuous basis are going to work 6 and you're going to what? Rest on the 7th. So, does the 7th day have an evening and morning for us?
Yes.
Yes, but that's not the focus in Genesis. The focus is upon who? Upon God. Let's notice here. Did the 7th day have a beginning and an end? Of course it did. Did God separate it from the other days?
Yes.
So must it have had a beginning? If it didn't have an end, God could not have separated it from the other days, because it would have been unending.
That's right.
Secondly, does the sun rise and set on the 7th day just like every other day?
Yes.
Notice this statement, Testimonies to Ministers, page 135. When the Lord declares that he made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. Now listen carefully to this. It has something to do with the 4th day. I'm not going to get into the 4th day of creation. You know, some people say, well, God created the light the first day and he made the sun, moon, and stars on the 4th day. How is that possible? I'm not going to get into that. I just want to share this and you can do your research. When the Lord declares that he made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, he means the day of 24 hours, which he has marked off by the rising and setting of the sun.
Amen.
How were the first 3 days of creation marked off?
Let the sun rise and set on the sun.
So must the sun have existed?
Yes.
I'll leave it there. Does the 7th day also have a numeral adjective, 7th? Yes, so it must be a literal day. Did God say from even till even shall you keep your Sabbath?
Yes.
So does the Sabbath have an evening?
Yes.
Of course it does, absolutely. At the end of the 7th day, God worked no more. But on the very next day, man began a new cycle of work. Now in the Bible, the Sabbath is consistently called what? The Sabbath of the Lord. God calls it my holy day. Why does God call it my holy day?
Because he laid it.
Because it's his before it's ours. To whom does this world belong and everything in it?
God.
To God? Why?
Because he created it.
So to whom does the Sabbath belong?
God.
Why?
Because he had it.
Because he made it. It's simply absurd to say, oh yeah, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything in it is God's. Yeah, okay, I agree, it's God's. What else did he make in creation? He made the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. He made the Sabbath. So to whom must the Sabbath belong? It must belong to God. And I repeat once again, folks, Sunday cannot be a holy day. Because what makes a day holy is God's rest.
Rest.
And the day that Jesus rested was on the Sabbath, according to the commandment.
Amen.
He rested in redemption, in the tomb, as he had rested at creation.
Yes.
2 final points. You can tell how much Satan hates the Sabbath by looking at the history of the Sabbath. What did Satan lead Israel to do before the Babylonian captivity? You read Ezekiel 20, it says they trampled the Sabbath, they desecrated the Sabbath, they broke the Sabbath. They were longing for the Sabbath to end so they could carry out their business on the Sabbath, according to the book of Amos. So what did God do? He sent them off into captivity. You say, he sent them to captivity because they broke the Sabbath? Read Jeremiah 17, the last few verses. It says, God burned the city and destroyed the city because they desecrated the Sabbath. So they come back from captivity after 70 years, and they say, you know, the reason why we were sent into captivity is because we broke the Sabbath. Now we're going to make a whole list of regulations so that we can't break the Sabbath so it doesn't happen again. And so the rabbis invented all kinds of rules and regulations, human traditions, to protect the Sabbath from being broken. And there's where you enter the Sabbath of the days of Christ. The Sabbath of the rabbis is not the Sabbath of the Lord. It is a Sabbath created by man. We need to understand that. By the way, what were the greatest controversies of Jesus over? The Sabbath. What's the great controversy going to be at the end of time?
The Sabbath.
There's only one difference. In the days of Christ, it was the wrong way. At the end of time, it's the wrong day. But it's still going to be the Sabbath. Are you with me? So after the captivity, the devil leads. He says, okay, you were sent to captivity. So the devil leads the religious leaders to create a counterfeit Sabbath full of rules and regulations. And now you have the next step of the devil's plan. Because of all these rules and regulations that the Jews had, the church reached the conclusion that the Jewish Sabbath was a burden that no one could bear. And so what happened shortly after the close of the first century? The Christian church says, we don't want anything to do with that Jewish Sabbath. And they began keeping what? Sunday. And then you move a little bit further forward, and you have a little horn who thinks that he can change what? God's holy law. And then at the end of time, what is the controversy over? The seal of God and the mark of the beast. Somehow I think the devil hates the Sabbath. You think? All you have to do, as you look at the Sabbath, how Satan looks at the Sabbath is by looking at history. Now, one final thing in closing. When God created Adam and Eve, they were not eyewitnesses of God creating anything. They were not eyewitnesses. They weren't around when God created everything the first 6 days. In fact, when God created Eve, he put Adam to sleep. So he didn't even see the creation of Eve. How could they be sure that God was the creator if they didn't see it? Because God said so. They had to trust God's word by faith. God said, I created all this. Keep the Sabbath so that you remember that I created all this. And Adam and Eve had to say, we didn't see it, but we believe it. We accept your word. They were supposed to live by faith that God was the creator. But now here comes the beauty. At the end of time, God's people will be eyewitnesses.
Amen. That's right.
In how many days do you think God is going to recreate His world?
Same.
You know, I used to think that God would simply say, let everything be new, and everything is new. But then I looked at Isaiah 66, and it says that to commemorate the recreation of the new heavens and new earth, we are going to come from Sabbath to Sabbath to worship before the Lord in commemoration of the new creation. They say, now wait a minute, you can't come every Sabbath unless you have the first 6. Right? So what God is going to do at the end of time, He is going to recreate this world, which by the way will have returned to the condition it was in before creation.
That's right.
Because Jeremiah said, I beheld the earth that was without form and void, the heavens had no light. The expression that is used in Genesis chapter 1 to describe the chaotic condition of the world, God is going to have to recreate everything as He did at the beginning. So you can imagine God's people are going to be there, and God is going to say, let there be light. Let there be the firmament. Let the earth produce trees and fragrant flowers and plants. By the way, everything has been scorched by the 4th plague. All the vegetation is dead. So now, God's people are looking and saying, oh, the world is becoming a botanical garden. And then God says, let the sun, moon, and stars occupy their proper places again. Because Ellen White says in early writings, page 41, that when Jesus speaks to deliver His people, the sun, moon, and stars will be moved out of their places. That's why the planet will be dark during the 1,000 years. according to Jeremiah, because sun, moon, and stars have been moved out of their places. So God is not going to make a new moon and new sun and new stars. He's simply going to take them from where they were moved, and He's going to place them to benefit the earth. And then God is going to say, let the waters produce living creatures. And let the skies be filled with birds. And let living creatures that creep upon the earth appear. And God's people will be eyewitnesses to what God is doing.
Amen.
We will now walk by sight, not by faith. We will now see it. And then when God finishes His work on the sixth day, He's going to say, come, my people, celebrate with me. Let's have a banquet together. Let's feast. I'm not talking about gluttony now. Let's feast. Let's make it a day of gladness. What do you think, my people, of what I've done? Oh, God's people are going to say, Lord, you outdid yourself. What a God you are.
Amen.
And God is going to say, so you don't forget. Tomorrow you will work. You will begin a cycle of work. And next Sabbath, you will come and we will celebrate again. Does that give you a different understanding of the Sabbath?
Amen.
The problem with the religious world is that they think the Sabbath of the rabbis is the Sabbath of the Lord. That's the whole problem. So it's a yoke of bondage. Nobody can bear it. It's just a list of rules and regulations because they're thinking that the Sabbath of the rabbis is the Sabbath of the Lord. And it's not. Well, did you understand what we studied?
Amen.
It makes sense? You think it's biblical?
Amen.
In harmony with the spirit of prophecy?
Amen.
Slightly different. So, contact 3ABN. And tell them it is not as heretical as people make it sound. Okay, we have time maybe just for one or two or three questions. We have a roving mic. Wait till the roving mic gets to you. Any questions? Raise your hand. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, Steve, I'll let you choose who you want to give it to. There's only one condition, that is you can only ask questions that I'm able to answer.
When it talks about the children of Israel, it means all 12 tribes of Israel, and the Jews were only 2 of the tribes of Israel, because the other 10 tribes were dispersed later on. So it's not just the Jews. The Jews are only 2 tribes.
Absolutely, correct.
So
And God is dealing today with spiritual Israel. If you are Christ, you are Abraham's seed.
yeah.
So if we're Abraham's seed, we must keep the Sabbath as Abraham and the Jews did. Good point. Okay, who's next? Louis, make it easy now.
I just want to make the statement that Israel includes the 12 tribes. So when you're talking about Israel and the Jews, it's still part of his people that he had. The whole
Oh, sure.
tribe of
Sure.
Israel.
Absolutely. There's no doubt whatsoever they were his people. Jacob.
You said that during the creation, at the end of the world, we will be witnesses as God will be creating all the 6 days and be creating man on the 6th day. Will God create new creatures?
I didn't say that God would create man on the 6th day. I said that he would create land creatures, and then God's people, he will invite God's people to come and relish his work of creation.
Yes.
Because human beings who were redeemed are going to be there contemplating it. They're not going to be created. They were already created.
Yeah,
They've been redeemed.
That part I understand.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good. I'm glad that you asked that question so it's clear.
In Isaiah 58:13 and 14, how can you reason with someone who says we're not supposed to do our own pleasure or find our own pleasure, and for example, going to the mountains on Sabbath,
Going where?
to the mountains on Sabbath, and they call that a sin, breaking the Sabbath, because it's pleasurable to one. How can you reason with someone like that?
Okay, basically what the text is saying is that you shall delight yourself in the Lord. Is that what it says? You shall delight yourself in the Lord. If you're going to the mountains just to have a great time, that's one thing. If you're going to the mountains to contemplate the grandeur of the great God who created them, who created the streams and who created the mountains, who gave us fresh air, who gave us sunshine, you say, wow, how great thou art. Then there's nothing wrong with having that kind of pleasure, because it's pleasure in the Lord. You shall delight yourself in the Lord.
Nature's God's second book.
That's right. We'll take two more.